The man known to history as Robert Oppenheimer was born on the 22nd of April 1904 as Julius Robert Oppenheimer in New York City. He quickly became known primarily by his middle name and is typically referred to today as Robert Oppenheimer or J. Robert Oppenheimer. Robert was born into an affluent Jewish family in New York City. His father, Julius, had been born in the Hesse-Nassau province in the territory of the Kingdom of Prussia, in what had just become the United German Empire, months prior to his birth, in May 1871. At a time of growing anti-Semitism across Western and Central Europe, Julius Oppenheimer left Germany in 1888 at 17 years of age, bound for the United States. Though virtually penniless, he prospered in America, and by the time Robert was born in 1904, he had risen to become a wealthy executive at one of Manhattan's leading textile manufacturers. Robert's mother was Ella Friedman, a woman of Jewish heritage as well, who had been born in New York in 1870 to a family of German Jews who had headed for America a generation before Julius Oppenheimer. She was a painter from whom Robert inherited some of his aesthetic views on the structure of existence and the universe. Ella and Julius would have one other child, a boy named Frank, who was born 8 years after Robert in 1912, and who would follow in the steps of his older brother by becoming a physicist. Robert's youth was a privileged one. By the mid-1900s, his father had become a substantial figure within New York business circles, and in the early 1910s, they moved into a large apartment on West 88th Street in Manhattan, overlooking the Central Park Reservoir in one of the most affluent areas of New York City at the time. There, the family had original works by Vincent van Gogh and Pablo Picasso, among others, on the walls. Robert attended the Ethical Culture School, followed by the Alcuin Preparatory School, two of New York's best educational establishments in the early 20th century. By the time he was 5, he was already interested in mineralogy, a hobby inherited from his German grandfather. Such was his aptitude that at 11 years of age, he was admitted to the Mineralogical Club of New York City. His precociousness extended into his secondary school years, and he finished his education at Alcuin in a year and a half less than the standard time, having taken 2 grade years in 12 months and being fast-tracked through the 8th grade. By this time, his interests had developed beyond mineralogy into the harder sciences, particularly chemistry. But it was eventually physics which would prove his calling in years to come. In 1922, Oppenheimer began studying at Harvard University at the age of 18. Robert initially intended to focus on studying chemistry, but soon switched to physics. Yet his earlier interest in chemistry and his eclectic inquisitiveness would serve him well in later years during a period when scientists were becoming all too specialized in specific fields. While studying at America's oldest college, he was deeply influenced by the teachings of Professor Percy Bridgman, an experimental physicist on the staff at Harvard at the time. This was also a period when students at Harvard and other elite universities in America still studied a very wide range of subjects, and Oppenheimer delved deeply into history and the Greek and Latin classics, which were still central to many Western curricula in the 1920s. Reflecting on his years at Harvard in later life, Oppenheimer noted that he spent most of his time in the library and read voraciously. He even attended more classes than it was necessary for him to. The result in 1925 was that Oppenheimer graduated with a Bachelor of Arts summa cum laude after just 3 years at Harvard, a distinction which usually took 4 years to attain, but which Oppenheimer, following an emerging pattern, completed in less than the standard time. Even before he graduated from Harvard, Oppenheimer had already been accepted to continue his studies at Cambridge University in England. This was the great center for the study of physics in Britain at the time, a reputation it has held and cultivated since Isaac Newton's days there in the late 17th century. The year that Oppenheimer spent at Cambridge between the fall of 1925 and the summer of 1926 was influential in his development, as he was exposed there to the teachings of Lord Ernest Rutherford, a New Zealand-born physicist who is typically understood to be the father of nuclear physics today. For instance, it was Rutherford who first discovered and explained what nuclear half-life and the radiation associated with it were, an achievement which Rutherford was awarded a Nobel Prize in Chemistry for in 1908. Towards the end of his first year at Cambridge, Oppenheimer, whose abilities were beginning to attract considerable attention amongst European physicists, accepted an offer from the German physicist Max Born to study under him at the University of Göttingen in Germany, one of Europe's great centers of learning. There, Oppenheimer studied with a number of contemporaries who would become giants of the study of theoretical physics during the 20th century, notably Werner Heisenberg, Enrico Fermi, and Edward Teller, several of whom Oppenheimer would work alongside during the Manhattan Project in the midst of the Second World War. Remarkably, Oppenheimer was awarded his PhD in physics in the spring of 1927, less than a year after arriving in Göttingen. The internal examiner, James Franck, who had won the Nobel Prize for Physics 2 years earlier in 1925, is famously said to have expressed relief when the oral examination, or viva voce, concluded, stating that Oppenheimer had easily defended his doctoral work and had seemed to be ready to begin questioning Franck. The great promise which Oppenheimer showed as a theoretical physicist, as he acquired his PhD around the same time he turned 23, was most clearly demonstrated in a paper which he and Born co-authored on the quantum theory of molecules in 1927, and which laid out what has come to be known as the Born-Oppenheimer approximation. This pertains to the fields of molecular dynamics, or how molecules move and interact. The approximation which Born and Oppenheimer demonstrated showed that the wave functions of nuclei and electrons within a molecule are different, owing to the fact that nuclei are considerably heavier than the electrons. This means that the coordinates of the nuclei are relatively fixed in place, whereas the lighter electrons are impacted on to a greater extent by wave functions, and their coordinates are consequently more dynamic. The approximation was reached by the pair to a great extent owing to Oppenheimer's dual interests in chemistry and physics, as the theory which they presented employed elements of quantum chemistry and molecular physics. In terms of its practical applicability, the approximation was important in allowing scientists from the late 1920s onwards to separate the motion of a nuclei and an electron. The individual who worked this out with Max Born, and who acquired his PhD at Göttingen, was a curious figure. Oppenheimer was a mix of a distant scientist and a relatively jovial individual, slipping from introversion to extroversion as occasion sometimes demanded, or as his mood was inclined. A chain smoker, he was perennially surrounded by a cloud of smoke throughout his adult life, a habit which would contribute substantially to his premature death in his early 60s. Individuals who knew him during his years at Harvard, Cambridge, and Göttingen recalled a person who was a strange mix of intelligence combined with a striking naivety at times, often making poor judgments and decisions and being prone to exaggeration. As the years went by, he developed an arrogant streak, but this was tempered by intellectual generosity to those who studied and worked with him, and those he taught in later years. A striking aspect of his personality was his interest in Eastern philosophy and mysticism, being particularly interested in Hinduism and Confucianism, even going so far as to learn Sanskrit, the sacred language of Hinduism, so that he might read the ancient texts of this faith in the original. This interest in religion and mysticism was not an eccentric pastime. For Oppenheimer, the study of physics was an entry point into understanding the mystical nature of the universe and existence, and his broader intellectual outlook was one of open curiosity rather than a quest for hard scientific data. There was, though, also an unstable and erratic side to Oppenheimer. His behavior at Harvard was sometimes questioned by fellow students and teachers. In 1926, while he was at Cambridge, he allegedly doused an apple with some illness-inducing chemicals and left it in the office of his tutor, Patrick Blackett, with whom he had had a difficult relationship, before heading off to France on holiday. Evidently, this action, and perhaps others besides, saw him briefly threatened with being suspended from his studies at Cambridge. A close friend of his in the 1920s, Francis Ferguson, who later went on to become an acclaimed theorist of stage performance and drama, claimed that Oppenheimer attacked him and tried to strangle him once when he told him he was engaged to be married. Underlying all of this erratic behavior was a strange mix of an individual who could be appallingly arrogant and fell out with a great many colleagues over the years as a result, but who many biographers have concluded was also a deeply insecure individual. The root of this may have been Oppenheimer's position as the son of a German Jewish émigré to America at a time when anti-Semitism was common across the Western world. He was a constant outsider, or at least felt like one, and is known to have suffered frequently from bouts of depression. He was, in short, something of an enigma. After completing his studies at Göttingen and publishing several more papers from the research he had undertaken in England and Germany, Oppenheimer returned to the United States, briefly holding fellowships at Harvard and the California Institute of Technology, punctuated by return visits to Europe to work for a few months at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands and at Zurich in Switzerland, where Albert Einstein had carried out much of his earliest and most groundbreaking work. In Leiden, he acquired his nickname Oppie, from a bowdlerized Dutch rendering of his name. It was not until 1929 that Oppenheimer settled back in America permanently, having been presented with numerous job offers from US universities. He accepted two and became an associate professor in physics at both the University of California at Berkeley and the California Institute of Technology, or Caltech. For the next 13 years, between 1929 and 1942, he would hold positions at both institutions, teaching during the fall and winter semesters at Berkeley before spending the spring term lecturing at Caltech in Pasadena. During the 1930s, Oppenheimer became famous within the physics community in the United States for his teaching methods, and the finest physicists of the mid-20th century in America trained under him at Berkeley and Caltech, at the School of Theoretical Physics which he founded. Within this, there was usually a cohort of a dozen or so advanced graduate students and research fellows who worked closely with Oppenheimer on some of the most relevant questions in the field of theoretical physics at the time. During busier times in term, they would often meet daily, with Oppenheimer quizzing them on their progress and offering suggestions thereon. Mostly, as several biographers who knew him during these days later recounted, he inspired those he taught, conveying to them the idea that they were at the forefront of answering some of the most important questions facing humanity at the time. Yet it was an eclectic academic environment, and when not discussing physics, Oppenheimer and his colleagues were often seen to be reading Plato in the original Greek or learning Sanskrit. Hans Bethe, who knew Oppenheimer during these days, later recalled that Robert was largely aloof from the wider world in the late 1920s and 1930s in California, only learning of the Wall Street crash of late 1929 months after it had happened. There were impressive scientific breakthroughs made by Oppenheimer and his students at Berkeley and Caltech during the 1930s. In 1930, for instance, Oppenheimer wrote a paper which effectively predicted the existence of the positron, or anti-electron, as an antiparticle of the electron, although its existence was not fully proven until 1932 by Carl David Anderson, a student who worked with Oppenheimer at Caltech. Following on from this, Oppenheimer worked closely with Wendell Furry to work out the modern form of the electron-positron theory and how the two interacted with each other. Perhaps his most important work, though, was a giant effort with Melba Phillips, one of Oppenheimer's first doctoral students at a time when female physicists were all too rare in the United States. Together, they proposed the Oppenheimer-Phillips process in 1935, a type of deuteron-induced nuclear reaction in which the neutron half of a deuteron fuses with a target nucleus, ejecting a proton in the process. This proved that some elements can become radioactive if bombarded by deuterons, and that a nuclear interaction can occur at lower energies than had previously been understood. This and many other breakthroughs by both Oppenheimer and his students at Berkeley and Caltech made California one of the world's great centers of theoretical physics in the mid-20th century. Oppenheimer's personal life was somewhat chaotic during this period. He had been diagnosed with a mild case of tuberculosis in the late 1920s, for which condition he sought out the dry desert air of Arizona and New Mexico in the years that followed, eventually buying a ranch in New Mexico. In the mid-1930s, he began a relationship with Jean Tatlock, a psychiatry student who was the daughter of John Strong Tatlock, an eminent Old English scholar and expert on the life and works of Geoffrey Chaucer. 10 years Robert's junior, Jean was a troubled young woman with severe depression and a conflicted sexuality. Their relationship was tempestuous, but continued through to 1940, even after Oppenheimer began seeing Kitty Harrison, a botanist and physicist at Caltech, who eventually divorced her second husband, Stuart Harrison, in November 1940 and married Robert the following day. It remains unclear to this day if Oppenheimer continued to periodically see Tatlock in the early 1940s prior to her taking her own life in January 1944. Robert and Kitty would subsequently have 2 children, a boy named Peter, who was born in May 1941, as Kitty had been pregnant already when they married, and a daughter named Catherine after her mother, who was born in 1944. Oppenheimer's life, like that of virtually every individual across Europe, North Africa, North America, and much of Asia, was hugely interrupted in the autumn of 1939 by the outbreak of the Second World War. The conflict came about as a direct result of the ascent to power in Germany of the Nazis, led by Adolf Hitler early in 1933. A rabidly anti-Semitic nationalist and fascist organization, the Nazis had made their twin goals to crush the Jewish people in Germany and to initiate a new war in Europe to overturn the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, which had brought the First World War to an end, and to build a new German Third Reich or empire which would dominate the continent. Oppenheimer was very familiar with the Nazis. As a Jew himself, albeit a non-observant one, he had become politically involved for the first time in his life during the mid-1930s, when he began setting aside 3% of his salary to help German Jews who were trying to flee Germany in the wake of the anti-Jewish Nuremberg laws, which were introduced from 1934 onwards. The Nazis' anti-Jewish policies had become more extreme from 1936 onwards, and particularly so in 1938, as Germany began annexing neighboring states, firstly Austria and then Czechoslovakia. With the invasion of Poland in September 1939, Britain and France declared war on Germany, but public opinion in the United States was not yet wholly in favor of intervention in what was deemed to be a European war. Therefore, America would remain officially neutral for the first 2 years of the conflict, though the administration of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was providing extensive support in the shape of war material to Britain from the war's inception. Oppenheimer's life and his place in history would be changed forever by the events of December 1941. By that time, the United States still remained neutral in the Second World War. Despite the desperate situation in Europe, with the Nazis conquering Poland in the autumn of 1939, Denmark and Norway the following spring, and then the Low Countries and France in the summer of 1940. With many other states like Italy, Hungary, and Romania allied with the Nazis, and invasions of Britain's colonies in North Africa and Russia afoot from the summer of 1941 onwards, it seemed that Germany was destined to dominate Europe. It was in this context that the Empire of Japan, an ultra-nationalist state bent on creating an Asiatic and Pacific empire, one which already included Korea, Manchuria, and much of eastern China by the early 1940s, decided to preemptively attack the United States without declaring war. The attack on Pearl Harbor in Hawaii and other American territories, such as the Philippines, on the 7th of December 1941, pulled the United States into the Second World War. Within days, the US was at war with Germany, Italy, and the other Axis states as the entirety of the Northern Hemisphere ended up at war. Oppenheimer would soon be catapulted to the center of America's research efforts during the conflict. This occurred in the context of efforts by Nazi Germany to acquire a weapon of mass destruction as a means of winning the war swiftly. In the 1920s and the 1930s, Germany had been home to some of the world's leading scientists, and so was well placed to develop a nuclear weapon. Nuclear fission, for instance, had been discovered by a team led by Otto Robert Frisch and Lisa Meitner in Berlin in 1938. Various experiments were initiated by the Nazis the following year to begin using this breakthrough to develop a nuclear weapon. Some of these focused on developing a nuclear reactor, while others favored the theory of using heavy water to produce an atomic weapon, research which was carried out in Nazi-occupied Norway throughout the war. Already in August 1939, President Roosevelt in Washington, D.C., had received a letter from the Hungarian nuclear physicist Leo Szilard and Albert Einstein, alerting the U.S. government to the threat posed by these Nazi experiments. Little effort was made to respond to this in 1939 or 1940, but with the entry of the U.S. into the war at the end of 1941, fresh consideration was given to America commencing its own research in this area. Oppenheimer would technically be in charge of the Los Alamos laboratory during the Second World War, but this was all under the umbrella of the Manhattan Project, a research and development program initiated by the U.S. government in 1942 with the ultimate aim of developing a nuclear bomb. The name comes simply from the fact that the team of individuals who were in charge of the wider project had their first headquarters where they met in 1942 on the island of Manhattan in New York City. Eventually, it grew from 1942 onwards to employ approximately 130,000 people across the country. They worked on various elements of the project in many states and regions. For instance, a large team working in Chicago throughout the war, which included Oppenheimer's old colleague from Göttingen, Enrico Fermi, and Leo Szilard, who had co-authored the letter to Roosevelt in 1939, warning the president about the Nazi nuclear program, developed the first working nuclear reactor there. Another team at the Hanford site in Washington state were charged with producing plutonium from uranium as a raw material for any future nuclear weapon, and a similar project was underway in Tennessee. There were even teams of individuals operating under the rubric of the Manhattan Project in Europe, carrying out espionage to try to uncover what the Nazis were working on. Oppenheimer would oversee the most critical research team of all those involved in the Manhattan Project as director of the Los Alamos Laboratory in New Mexico. He was very nearly not picked for this position. The individual who oversaw the Manhattan Project was Major General Leslie Groves. Groves is not exactly a household name today, but he has the distinction of having been in charge of both the Manhattan Project, which created the first nuclear weapon, and also overseeing the construction of the Pentagon as the headquarters of the U.S. military and Department of Defense. Oppenheimer was suggested to Groves in 1942 as a possible candidate to lead a team of theoretical physicists and scientists as part of the Manhattan Project, but Groves was initially skeptical, favoring the idea of appointing someone who had been awarded a Nobel Prize in physics and would consequently have enough academic gravitas to lead a team of some of the most eminent minds of the day. He was eventually persuaded that Oppenheimer had a track record of getting the best out of people he worked with. He contacted Oppenheimer, and after interviewing him, came to the conclusion that he was well suited for the post. In the weeks that followed in the early winter of 1942, Oppenheimer scouted out a suitable location for the establishment of a research center, somewhere remote and away from any urban centers, where secrecy would be ensured and a nuclear weapon could be tested in due course. He eventually settled on Los Alamos in New Mexico, where a research facility was erected on the site of an old school. This was subcontracted to the University of California through the War Department, so that Oppenheimer had some degree of autonomy in hiring and firing as director of the Los Alamos Laboratory. Although there would be more hiring than firing, at its height there were well over 5,000 people employed at Los Alamos, far more than Oppenheimer had initially anticipated. The team that Oppenheimer assembled at Los Alamos included some of the finest scientists of the first half of the 20th century. One was John Hasbrouck van Vleck, a physicist and mathematician who had been at Harvard when Oppenheimer arrived there in 1922. He was subsequently awarded a Nobel Prize in 1977 for his work on electronic magnetism. Van Vleck made significant contributions to the gun design which would be used in the bomb used over Hiroshima. The research teams at Los Alamos, working on a wide range of finer details about how the first atomic weapon could be constructed. The task which confronted this team of physicists and other engineers and scientists was daunting. When they assembled at Los Alamos, they had little to work on other than a theoretical knowledge of how a nuclear chain reaction could be produced. But what must be remembered in an age when we know what a nuclear explosion looks like, and the destruction that it results in, is that Oppenheimer and his colleagues at Los Alamos were not just trying to build a nuclear weapon, but also to predict what would happen when one exploded. Thus, there was an enormous amount of experimentation and theoretical speculation throughout 1943 and 1944. Throughout it all, Oppenheimer worked exhaustively. As Hans Bethe recollected years later, his uncanny speed in grasping the main points of any subject was a decisive factor. He could acquaint himself with the essential details of every part of the work. He did not direct from the head office. He was intellectually and even physically present at each decisive step. Yet the incredibly arduous work schedule which Oppenheimer followed at Los Alamos also took a toll on his health. He was always a thin person, but during the work in New Mexico, he lost another 20 pounds, eventually weighing as little as 110 pounds or less than 8 stone. During the course of 1943, research efforts at Los Alamos began to focus on a prototype codenamed Thin Man. This was a plutonium gun-type weapon, which would work more like an artillery gun to detonate rather than an implosion-type bomb. The research into producing this was extremely complex from a logistical perspective, with the polonium, which was used in the initiator, having to be obtained from ores in Ontario, in Canada, and then manufactured at a separate facility in Tennessee, which was also part of the wider Manhattan Project, or at the Hanford site in Washington state. However, more complex still was the design issue. In order for the gun-type weapon to work, a plutonium bullet which would be fired off inside the bomb would have to be accelerated to a speed of 3,000 feet per second, or over 3,200 kilometers per hour, or else the nuclear fission would begin before the rest of the mechanics of the bomb were ready for a successful explosion. This was ultimately the undoing of the Thin Man design, as it was realized during the course of 1944 that the gun barrel needed to produce this speed would be far too large to be employed in a bomb of a kind which could be transported on board a B-29 Flying Superfortress, the newly designed heavy bombers which were to be used to transport any nuclear bomb developed by the US government. This, along with issues relating to the use of plutonium in a gun-type bomb, saw the Thin Man design abandoned in April 1944. With the abandonment of the Thin Man design, Oppenheimer redeployed many of the scientists and engineers who had been working on it to another design called Little Boy. This was a simplified gun-type fission bomb, but unlike the Thin Man, it was intended that uranium-235 would be used instead of plutonium for the nuclear fission that would create the explosion. Simultaneously, a third type of design was being progressed. The Fat Man, as it was known, would use plutonium but was designed as an implosion-type bomb. The design team for it was led by an American physicist by the name of Seth Neddermeyer. Oppenheimer continued to favor the gun-type design even as the Fat Man was being furthered during the course of 1943 and 1944. Oppenheimer's brilliance as an overseer at Los Alamos was seen in his decision to bring John von Neumann, a Hungarian-born mathematician and physicist, to Los Alamos in 1943 to review the design. It was von Neumann who suggested a spherical shape and shaped charges which would reduce the amount of plutonium needed and make the assembly of an implosion-type bomb more practical and achievable. Over the next several months, metallurgists at Los Alamos had to try to solve the problem of how to cast plutonium into a sphere, but this was eventually overcome when a plutonium-gallium alloy was devised, one which was pressed into spheres and coated with nickel. The design process was nearing completion. As 1945 dawned at Los Alamos, Oppenheimer's teams were coming close to completing both the design of the Little Boy and Fat Man. Consequently, there were two plausible candidates for a successfully built nuclear weapon. In the end, both would be completed at roughly the same time, as design problems were worked out in the spring of 1945 and the required levels of enriched uranium and plutonium were produced in the sites in Washington state and Tennessee. The latter were enormous undertakings. given the technology available to the Manhattan Project, as it was extremely costly and time-consuming to enrich these to become fissile substances in the mid-1940s. Other elements which needed to be resolved were engineering problems for the most part. For instance, the Fat Man bomb was being assembled using a huge array of approximately 1,500 bolts in 1944, an impractical amount in order to develop a working bomb. By the time it was completed in the early summer of 1945, Oppenheimer's team had reduced this to just 90 bolts. Other technical issues concerned how the bomb would descend when dropped from a height, and throughout 1944 and 1945, tests were done to assess how a bomb of the size and structure of the Fat Man and Little Boy would fall through the air. All of this came together during the course of the spring of 1945, and by midsummer, Oppenheimer was able to deliver the head of the Manhattan Project, Major General Leslie Groves, the news that they were ready to conduct a test detonation. The Trinity nuclear test was carried out in the Jornada del Muerto Desert in New Mexico on the 16th of July, 1945. Fittingly, the desert's name, translated from the Spanish, means Dead Man's Root. Oppenheimer revealed in correspondence with Groves in 1962 that he codenamed the test Trinity as he had been reading the religious poetry of the 17th century English poet John Donne around the time that he came up with the name. The device which would be used during the test was a Fat Man bomb, using plutonium and of an implosion type. For the purposes of the test, the bomb in question was christened the Gadget. In order for the test to be carried out safely, a location was chosen which was highly remote, almost entirely unpopulated and otherwise isolated. There was only one building on the proposed blast site, the McDonald Ranch House, which had been built there by a German migrant in 1913 and which had been forcefully vacated in 1942 by the McDonald family after the US government took over the region under the remit of the Manhattan Project. The test was a carefully planned thing, as the plutonium which was to be used had cost billions of dollars to produce in today's money. Such were the tortuous methods involved in enriching uranium and plutonium at the time. Much hinged on its success. As Groves noted at the time, he didn't want to explain to a congressional committee why he had blown up $1 billion worth of plutonium in the desert for no reason. The Trinity test was carried out near dawn on the morning of the 16th of July. Observation shelters were established in 3 different places to the north, south, and west of the blast site, each approximately 9 kilometers away from where the bomb would be detonated. Goggles were provided to prevent against harmful ultraviolet wavelengths, while the distance was considered safe enough in terms of the radioactive half-life which would be produced. Many of the observers that morning were scientists and included Oppenheimer, Teller, Bethe, Enrico Fermi, and John von Neumann. Some believed that the bomb would not work. Others were concerned about exactly how destructive it could prove to be. They had their answers at 5:29 a.m. when the Gadget exploded, releasing explosive energy equivalent to 25,000 tons of TNT. This created a crater 1/3 of a kilometer wide and melted the sand across the launch site, turning it into a light green glass-like rock. The observers, 9 kilometers away, did not hear the immense noise from the shockwave for 40 seconds after the detonation. But by that time, they were witnessing a growing fireball which changed color from purple, green and orange eventually to white. Then it coalesced into a mushroom cloud, one which eventually spiraled 12 kilometers into the sky. The shock from the explosion was felt nearly 100 kilometers away, while those at the observation shelters 9 kilometers away later recollected that there was a brief period of immense heat, like they were standing in front of an open oven for a few seconds momentarily, when the bomb detonated. Oppenheimer's supposed words as he watched the Trinity test explosion have become somewhat infamous in modern times. He is alleged to have quoted from the Bhagavad Gita, one of the holiest texts in Hinduism, one which was written in the second half of the first millennium BC, and the title of which approximates to the Song by God. The Gita is a 700-verse scripture, which primarily revolves around Prince Arjuna and his guide, the Hindu deity Krishna. on a wide range of moral and religious matters. It is widely and mistakenly believed that Oppenheimer quoted a line from the Gita in which another Hindu god Vishnu says, "I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Although the line would have been a fitting utterance that morning in New Mexico, in reality, Oppenheimer never said this. Instead, recalling the event 20 years later, he said that another line from the Gita ran through his head, one in which it is stated, "If the radiance of 1,000 suns were to burst at once into the sky, that would be like the splendor of the Mighty One." On reflection, in 1965, he thought the other line would have been more fitting, but despite the myth that has developed, Oppenheimer never actually uttered the words, "I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." However, for what in retrospect should have been a sobering moment, the general reaction in the observation shelters was one of glee that the Manhattan Project had succeeded. Oppenheimer, it was later noted, was jubilant. The ramifications of their success, though, would become all too clear within a matter of weeks. Within weeks of the Trinity test explosion, the atomic bomb would be used as a weapon of war. By that time, the conflict in Europe had come to an end, as the Allies had streamed into Germany from both east and west in the spring of 1945, leading to Hitler taking his own life in Berlin in late April, and the Nazis surrendering just over a week later. However, the Empire of Japan had indicated no willingness to surrender, and Japanese honor systems and military culture seemed to suggest an invasion of the Japanese islands would be necessary to bring the war in the Pacific to an end. The US government had calculated that this could result in millions of deaths as the Japanese would fight to the bitter end. Consequently, the decision was quickly taken to utilize the new atomic bomb as a demonstration to the Japanese government of the new weapon which was available to the administration, which was now headed by President Harry Truman, who had succeeded to the White House following President Roosevelt's death in office in mid-April 1945. The result was the bombing of the Japanese city of Hiroshima, with one of the little boy bombs on the 6th of August 1945. In Los Alamos that evening, Oppenheimer was triumphant and seemed to regret the fact that the weapon had not been available to use against the Nazis in Germany. However, this mood quickly gave way to disillusionment 3 days later, when the US dropped a second bomb of the Fat Man type on the city of Nagasaki in Japan. Surely Oppenheimer and his colleagues concluded this was not acceptable. After all, the Japanese had not been given enough time to process the implications of the first bomb and to decide to surrender, which they did 6 days after the bombing of Nagasaki. With that, the war came to an end. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki remain the only 2 occasions in world history when nuclear weapons have been utilized in warfare. They are accordingly enormously controversial. Today, most analysts of the events of August 1945 tend to take the same view as Oppenheimer and his colleagues did, that the use of the first bomb in Hiroshima was somewhat justifiable, though imminently regrettable at the same time, as a means of forcing the Japanese to surrender and in the process potentially saving millions of lives by avoiding a land invasion of the Japanese archipelago. But most are agreed that the bombing of Nagasaki just 3 days later was unwarranted. More broadly, the ethical implications of the work Oppenheimer and his colleagues carried out as part of the Manhattan Project during the war have been questioned. There are 2 sides to this. On the one hand, the development of nuclear weapons has introduced an existential threat to humanity's survival in modern times. But on the other hand, the nuclear deterrent has ensured that the world's superpowers and large states have avoided major wars ever since 1945. For centuries, Europe's states had been endlessly at war with one another. That all changed once it became apparent that direct conflict could result in mutually assured destruction. Ironically, the impact of the development of nuclear weapons has been to foster a nuclear peace, but the risks remain profound in a world where politics are becoming more antagonistic and destabilized during the 21st century. With the end of the war, Oppenheimer's reputation was at an unprecedented height within American academic circles. There were accordingly new opportunities open to him, and he decided to leave Berkeley and head to the East Coast to take up a position as director of the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton in New Jersey in 1947, an esteemed center for the study of physics in the United States, which included Albert Einstein, Niels Bohr, and Paul Dirac as former charter members or visiting fellows. Under Oppenheimer's leadership, it became a center for emerging physicists, and when he left Berkeley, a half a dozen of his more promising graduate students left also to study at Princeton. In New Jersey, he continued the methods he had developed in California in the 1930s, producing an environment of energetic discussion and research, often at the expense of his own research. Oppenheimer choosing to write and publish very little himself at Princeton. As a result, the institute became the leading center for the study of physics in the United States in the late 1940s and early 1950s. Many of the most important physicists of the second half of the 20th century passed through the institute, notably Yoshiro Nambu, a Japanese-American who in 2008 would be co-awarded the Nobel Prize for his role in discovering the spontaneous broken symmetry in subatomic physics, and Murray Gell-Mann, who won the Nobel Prize in 1969 for his work on elementary particles. As well as his work at Princeton, Oppenheimer continued to hold a number of government positions throughout the late 1940s and into the 1950s, while also having security clearance to view classified documents and material relating to the United States' evolving nuclear program. Notable in this respect was his membership of the newly established Atomic Energy Commission, which had been founded in 1947 as a commission headed by the United Nations, itself a newly created body designed to foster world peace in the aftermath of the war. The Energy Commission was charged with regulating the proliferation of nuclear materials and the development of nuclear weaponry. While the United States was for several years the only nation with access to nuclear bombs after 1945, it was only a matter of time, now that the world had seen that it was possible to develop such weapons, before other nation-states began building their own bombs or trying to develop them. Oppenheimer and several of his former colleagues from the Manhattan Project were central to efforts in 1946 and 1947 to establish restrictions on nuclear proliferation, which are still in force today. As the first chairman of the commission, Oppenheimer tried to discourage a nuclear arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union in the context of the developing Cold War, but these efforts were in vain, and a major nuclear arms race developed once the Soviets conducted their first successful test of a nuclear weapon in 1949. As news of the Soviet acquirement of a nuclear weapon reached the US in 1949, debate began within the government of President Harry Truman about the development of a hydrogen or thermonuclear bomb, a far more powerful nuclear weapon than the atomic bombs which had been developed under the rubric of the Manhattan Project and used against Japan in 1945. Oppenheimer and a great many other scientists who had contributed to the work at the Los Alamos Laboratory between 1942 and 1945 were opposed to such a measure, arguing that such a weapon could not be used in any practical sense in warfare without causing immense damage and potentially triggering a nuclear war, which would wipe out much of life on the planet. In their petition to the government in late 1949, they stated that the extreme danger to mankind inherent in the proposal to develop thermonuclear weapons wholly outweighs any military advantage. Nevertheless, Truman pressed ahead and greenlit the new program in January 1950. Nearly 3 years later, in November 1952, the first hydrogen bomb was tested on an atoll in the Pacific Ocean. Ivy Mike, as the bomb was named, produced an explosion equivalent to over 10 million tons of TNT and was 450 times more powerful than the atomic bomb which the US dropped on Nagasaki in 1945. Despite the reservations expressed by Oppenheimer and many others, the Cold War was heading into the era of mutually assured destruction. As much as he had been absolutely central to the Manhattan Project and a senior government scientist for many years, Oppenheimer fell foul of the government in the early 1950s during the Second Red Scare. These were years when the Cold War with the Soviet Union was deepening, following the division of Germany into a Western-aligned West Germany and a communist East Germany, along with the formation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and the Warsaw Pact as a rival military alliance, while the Korean War pitted the Western and communist blocs against each other for the first time in a major proxy war. In this environment, America became racked with what were initially legitimate concerns about communist organizations within the United States, acting as a fifth column for the Soviet Union within America. But this soon gave way to intense and unfounded paranoia about the motives of anyone associated with socialist politics, or even groups such as the American Civil Liberties Union. The Second Red Scare, which is termed as such to distinguish it from the First Red Scare, which struck America in the late 1910s following the Russian Revolution of 1917, gathered pace from the late 1940s and was at its most intense between 1950 and 1954, as Senator Joseph McCarthy undertook extensive efforts to identify and bring to trial anyone even remotely suspected of communist sympathies. Oppenheimer would soon come under suspicion during the Second Red Scare. Oppenheimer's associations with socialist and left-wing political movements and civil liberties organizations in America stretched back to the mid-1930s, when, after being largely apolitical throughout his youth, he began to finally take an interest in political affairs. This led him to join a number of left-wing and progressive movements at a time when socialist parties and organizations were seen as the logical opposition to the growing fascist tide across Europe, particularly so from 1936 onwards, when the Soviet Union and other communist parties supported the Republicans against the nationalists in the Spanish Civil War. It should be noted, however, that Oppenheimer never actually joined the Communist Party of the United States, though a great many individuals who were very close to him were active members, including Jean Tatlock, with whom he was involved romantically from 1936 onwards, his wife Kitty, and his brother Frank. Other movements which Robert was involved in, such as the American Civil Liberties Union, were also considered radical between the 1930s and 1950s, but are now viewed as the torchbearers of the civil rights movement which ended segregation after nearly a century. All of this ensured that Oppenheimer was viewed with some suspicion by the authorities, a development which was compounded by his father's birth in Germany once the United States entered the Second World War, though this was a complete oxymoron, as Oppenheimer's Jewish background would have made him a persona non grata to the Nazi regime in Berlin. Nevertheless, suspicions abounded about Oppenheimer. He was even under surveillance throughout America's involvement in the Second World War, a bizarre period during which he was one of the most senior figures involved in the Manhattan Project, but the FBI simultaneously had a file open on him. These issues coalesced by 1949, and that year Oppenheimer was forced to testify before the House Un-American Activities Committee about his political associations. During this, he admitted to ties to the Communist Party and that many of his more prominent students at Berkeley in the 1930s had also been official members of the party, but stated he had never been a member himself. Not much more came of the interrogation at this juncture, but 4 years later, in the early winter of 1953, the accusations against Oppenheimer were resurrected, and on this occasion, the FBI were convinced, wrongly as it turns out, that Oppenheimer was a Soviet asset operating within the US. Such was the level of paranoia which pertained within America at the time of the Second Red Scare. In mid-December 1953, Oppenheimer's security clearance for the US government was revoked, and he was advised to resign from his government positions. This Oppenheimer refused to do, and demanded a hearing, one which was held behind closed doors in the late spring of 1954. During this, Oppenheimer was completely undermined by his old colleague Edward Teller, who testified that he had found Oppenheimer's behavior questionable at times during his time as director of the Los Alamos laboratory. With this betrayal, Oppenheimer was stripped of his security clearance and cast into the political and social wilderness in the mid-1950s. The years following his security hearing and the revocation of his security clearance were difficult ones for Oppenheimer. The reaction within the academic community was mixed. Most of his colleagues defended Oppenheimer, but the bureaucrats and administrators who ran the American universities were often less sanguine, with many cancelling lectures and appearances which Oppenheimer was scheduled to give. Oppenheimer's own confidence was dented, and he refrained from overt involvement in numerous initiatives launched by figures like Einstein to warn the government and American society about the dangers of excessive nuclear proliferation. Instead, he spent an increasing amount of time away from the continental United States, relocating to the Virgin Islands in the Caribbean, a U.S. overseas territory. Here, he purchased an estate on what was then known as Gibney Beach on the island of St. John, but which has since become known colloquially as Oppenheimer Beach. He spent extended periods here from 1957 onwards, though there were many institutions and organizations within America that continued to invite him to guest lecture. Yet the 1950s were notably lean years for him from a research perspective, during which he barely published anything. By the late 1950s, there were concerted efforts underway to rehabilitate Oppenheimer abroad. For instance, in 1957, the French government awarded him the Légion d'honneur in recognition for his wartime service to the Allied cause. In 1962, he was made a foreign member of the Royal Society in Britain. By that time, there was an increasing awareness at home in America that the Second Red Scare had been utterly excessive in its prosecution of individuals who had been only vaguely associated with the American Communist movement and had no real ties of any kind with the Soviet Union. Accordingly, in 1963, President John F. Kennedy moved to rehabilitate Oppenheimer by awarding him the Enrico Fermi Award, an award which had been created in 1956 by the U.S. Department of Energy and named in honor of Enrico Fermi, the Italian-American scientist who had developed the world's first nuclear reactor in Chicago in 1942 as part of the early stages of the Manhattan Project, and who had died prematurely of stomach cancer in 1954. The award had been bestowed on several individuals who had worked at the Los Alamos laboratory under Oppenheimer between 1943 and 1945, including von Neumann, Bethe, and Teller in 1956, 1961, and 1962 respectively. Hence, Oppenheimer's receipt of the award in 1963 was belated but a welcome acknowledgement of the government's mistake in persecuting him as part of the Red Scare. Oppenheimer did not live long to enjoy having his reputation partially restored. 2 years after he was awarded the Fermi Award, he was diagnosed in late 1965 with throat cancer, an illness which was undoubtedly caused by his lifelong chain smoking. This was a time when many forms of cancer which are treatable today were effectively a death sentence. Thus, while Oppenheimer underwent aggressive chemotherapy in an effort to prolong his life, he fell into a coma early in 1967 and died at home in Princeton on the 18th of February. He was 62 years of age. While his reputation had been only partly rehabilitated by the bestowal of the Enrico Fermi Award in 1963, and many political figures continued to view him suspiciously, the academic community clearly demonstrated its respect for Oppenheimer at a funeral service which was attended by over 600 colleagues from within academia, the scientific community, and the military, a great many of whom had worked with Oppenheimer at Los Alamos. His ashes were later deposited in the waters off St. John's Island in the Caribbean in an urn. In the decades since, his reputation has been fully rehabilitated. By way of contrast, Edward Teller, who testified against Oppenheimer at his closed-doors hearing in 1954, was spurned by many within the American scientific community for decades to come. In 1967, Oppenheimer was posthumously nominated for the third time for the Nobel Prize for Physics. He had previously been nominated in 1946 and 1951, but he had not received the accolade on those occasions, nor did he in 1967. There has been considerable attention given over the years as to why he did not receive the Nobel Prize, given his extensive accomplishments. But there would seem to be clear reasons why he did not. Firstly, Oppenheimer did not publish extensively. Unlike someone like Albert Einstein, who published over 300 scientific papers during his lifetime and many books later in his life. By way of contrast, Oppenheimer published just 5 academic papers after the Second World War. Furthermore, while he contributed to numerous fields of inquiry within physics, he did not make the kind of theoretical or applied breakthrough in any one specific area which would have warranted a Nobel Prize. The Nobels are not awarded for a lifetime's work, but generally for a specific scientific accomplishment. Einstein, for instance, won his primarily for his work on the photoelectric effect. Hence, Oppenheimer was deemed not to have warranted a Nobel Prize for his individual contributions to science, though some have speculated that his work on gravitational collapse was worthy of one. His primary accomplishments throughout his career lay in collaborative work and overseeing teams of physicists and other scientists. It was this which made him the ideal individual to head the Los Alamos laboratory during the war. Robert Oppenheimer is one of the most important theoretical physicists in history. His research and work between the 1920s and 1960s added substantially to our understanding of the universe, notably the manner in which the Born-Oppenheimer approximation transformed our understanding of molecular dynamics from 1927 onwards, and how the Oppenheimer-Phillips process allowed for a deuteron-induced nuclear reaction after Oppenheimer and Melba Phillips provided an explanation for this phenomenon in 1935. But he will forever be remembered for his role in the Manhattan Project as director of the Los Alamos Laboratory. In this capacity, Oppenheimer might be said to have been the lead physicist in U.S. efforts to develop an atomic bomb during the Second World War. Whatever the existential and moral implications of the introduction of such weapons into the world might be, there is no doubt that this research was considered necessary in the context of the times. Oppenheimer was clearly troubled by what he and his colleagues had unleashed into the world, and spent much of the post-war period arguing against the development of even more deadly weapons of mass destruction. It was in part owing to this that he found himself persecuted and prosecuted by the government he had worked for in the early 1950s, and cast into the wilderness as a result of the Second Red Scare. His legacy, though, is alive and well today. An eccentric man who viewed the physical universe in mystical terms, Oppenheimer should surely be remembered